Robert William Pickton, born on October 24, 1949, in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, would later become infamous as one of Canada's most disturbing serial killers. But to understand how he earned the grim title of the Pig Farmer Killer, it is necessary to look back at his early life, his family, and the environment that shaped him into the man he became. Pickton was born into a family of pig farmers. His parents, Leonard and Louise Pickton, were strict, frugal, and deeply absorbed in the farm's operations. The family home was far from warm or nurturing. Instead, it was marked by neglect, harsh discipline, and an absence of emotional care. Louise, his mother, was particularly dominant, controlling, cold, and unsympathetic. She was more concerned with the pigs than with the emotional needs of her children. The Pickton household did not provide comfort, encouragement, or affection. Rather, it demanded labor and obedience. From a young age, Robert, known as Willie to those around him, was described as shy, socially awkward, and often withdrawn. He struggled in school, both academically and socially. His clothes were often dirty. He smelled of the farm, and he lacked the confidence to form strong friendships. Teachers noted that he had difficulty keeping up with lessons, and he seemed more comfortable with animals than with people. His peers bullied him, further deepening his sense of isolation. One pivotal moment in his childhood would haunt him for life. At around 14 years old, Robert and his siblings were given calves to raise. He developed a bond with his calf, treating it almost like a companion. But without warning, his mother had the calf slaughtered. For Robert, it was not just the loss of an animal. It was the brutal realization that his feelings were insignificant. That trauma left a deep scar, reinforcing his emotional detachment and shaping his future capacity to view living beings as disposable. Despite his difficulties, Robert grew into adulthood working on the family pig farm. The Pickton farm was large, about 17 acres, and located in a semi-rural area not far from Vancouver. The business itself was modest, supplying pigs to local markets, but it provided the family with a steady income. Over time, Robert and his brother David inherited the farm after their parents' deaths. Instead of running a professional agricultural business, however, the farm became a messy, unregulated environment. It was poorly maintained, cluttered with scrap, and eventually became notorious for the activities that would occur there. In his 20s and 30s, Robert remained socially awkward, never marrying and never establishing long-term relationships. He developed a reputation in Port Coquitlam as a loner, eccentric, and sometimes odd, but not outwardly threatening. He was known to frequent bars and low-income neighborhoods, sometimes befriending women who lived on the margins of society. But there was an undercurrent of darkness, an inability to connect in normal ways, and a growing resentment toward women. By the 1980s, Robert Pickton was well into adulthood, still operating the farm with his brother. They began hosting wild parties in buildings on the property, attracting bikers, drug users, and marginalized individuals. The farm became a magnet for those living on society's edges, particularly women involved in sex work or struggling with addiction. These women were vulnerable, often unnoticed by law enforcement, and tragically became easy targets. At this stage, the warning signs of what Robert was capable of were beginning to emerge. Reports later revealed that he had encounters with the police in the late 1990s, long before his eventual arrest. But in his early life and adult years, Robert Pickton had perfected the image of a strange, yet seemingly harmless pig farmer. Behind the facade, however, was a man who lacked empathy, carried unresolved trauma, and was increasingly drawn to the idea of control and domination over those who were most vulnerable. One of the critical aspects of Robert's character was his ability to mask his intentions. To many, he appeared eccentric, maybe even pitiful. He wore second-hand clothes, spoke awkwardly, and seemed incapable of serious harm. But that image served him well, because it allowed him to go unnoticed. It made people underestimate him, even dismiss him as unimportant. This underestimation proved catastrophic for the women who crossed his path. To fully understand Robert Pickton's descent into infamy, it's important to recognize how the circumstances of his upbringing created the perfect storm. A childhood devoid of love, paired with traumatic experiences, social rejection, and a life spent in the grim environment of a pig farm, left him emotionally stunted. As an adult, instead of moving forward or seeking meaningful human connections, he withdrew further into isolation. And in that isolation, dark fantasies began to form. By the 1990s, Robert Pickton was no longer just an odd pig farmer. He was preparing to carry out a series of crimes that would shock Canada and the world. The quiet, awkward man who had once raised pigs was now about to become one of the country's most prolific serial killers, preying on the forgotten and vulnerable in society. The stage was set. The farm, with its isolation and vast grounds, provided the perfect cover. His reputation as a harmless recluse provided the camouflage. And the women who entered his life, often desperate for safety, shelter, or money, had no idea that behind his soft-spoken demeanor was a predator. This is the unsettling beginning of the story of Robert Pickton, the pig farmer whose crimes would horrify a nation and leave behind questions that remain to this day. How could someone like him go unnoticed for so long? Why did authorities fail to act on early warnings? And how many lives could have been saved if action had been taken sooner? As the 1990s unfolded, Robert Pickton's pig farm in Port Coquitlam transformed from a rundown agricultural property into the scene of one of Canada's darkest criminal cases. What had once been simply a dirty, cluttered farm now became the hunting ground for a serial killer. The farm's isolation, its chaotic environment, and Pickton's unassuming demeanor created the perfect cover for crimes that would go unnoticed for years. Pickton preyed on women who were among society's most vulnerable. Many of his victims came from Vancouver's downtown Eastside, a neighborhood known for poverty, addiction, and sex work. These women were often ignored by broader society, living on the margins, and tragically, they were precisely the kind of people who could vanish without immediate alarm. For Pickton, they represented opportunity. For law enforcement, their disappearances were often dismissed as runaways, transients, or individuals lost to the drug trade. This failure to recognize a pattern early on gave Pickton the freedom to continue his crimes unchecked. The method by which Pickton lured his victims was disturbingly simple. He would offer them rides, drugs, or a place to stay on his farm. His reputation in certain circles as a somewhat odd but harmless man worked in his favor. Many women accepted his invitations, seeing him as a strange farmer rather than a threat. Once on the farm, they were isolated, surrounded by pigs, outbuildings, and heavy machinery. It was a place where screams could go unheard and where the soil could cover countless secrets. Though the exact number of women Pickton killed is still debated, investigators believe the count could be far higher than the 26 charges he was eventually linked to. In later confessions, Pickton even boasted of killing 49 women, stopping short of 50 only so he wouldn't get sloppy. While his claims may have been exaggerated, the evidence uncovered at the farm pointed to an unimaginable scale of violence. The disposal of bodies was one of the most chilling aspects of Pickton's crimes. On a pig farm, with access to both animals and rendering equipment, he found ways to make his victims vanish. Some remains were fed to pigs, while others were disposed of through farm machinery. This horrifying reality meant that evidence was often destroyed or scattered, making it nearly impossible for investigators to recover complete remains. When police finally began excavations years later, the scale of the search was staggering. Tons of soil and debris had to be sifted through, with fragments of human remains found across the property. One disturbing detail was that Pickton seemed to take pride in his methods. His casual boasts to acquaintances revealed not only the crimes, but also his lack of remorse. He described his killings with disturbing nonchalance, as though he were speaking about routine farm work. To those who later heard his confessions, it was chilling how ordinary he made the extraordinary evil sound. The farm itself became a symbol of horror. Investigators later described it as filthy, chaotic, and covered in refuse. Old vehicles, junk, and pig pens made the property a nightmare to search. And yet, beneath the filth and clutter, there were clues: women's clothing, personal items, DNA traces, and remains. Each discovery painted a clearer picture of the atrocities that had taken place. But the question remains: how did Pickton manage to continue his killing spree for so long without being caught? Part of the answer lies in society's neglect of marginalized women. For years, families of the missing pleaded with police to investigate patterns of disappearances in the downtown Eastside. But time and again, the response was slow, indifferent, or dismissive. Some women were written off as transient. Others were assumed to have left the city voluntarily. This lack of urgency allowed Pickton to keep luring victims without fear of immediate consequence. There were also moments when Pickton narrowly escaped capture. In 1997, for example, a woman managed to escape from his farm after being attacked. She reported the incident, but the case was not pursued aggressively. Had her warnings been taken seriously, dozens of lives might have been saved. Instead, Pickton remained free and his killing continued. The community itself had rumors swirling for years. People who knew Pickton described his farm as strange, his behavior unsettling, and his parties reckless. Yet, no one could have imagined the scale of his crimes. It was only in 2002, after decades of murders, that police finally arrested him. But by then, the damage had been done, and countless women were gone. Pickton's crimes struck a nerve across Canada, not just because of their brutality, but because they exposed a larger failure. Society had failed to protect its most vulnerable. Law enforcement had failed to take missing women seriously, and communities had failed to see the warning signs. In many ways, Pickton's reign of terror was as much about institutional neglect as it was about his own actions. For the families of the victims, the discovery of what had taken place on the farm was devastating. Many had spent years searching for answers, reporting their loved ones missing, and pleading for action. To learn that their daughters, sisters, and mothers had been lured to a pig farm and brutally killed was almost too much to bear. The farm became not just a crime scene, but a mass graveyard of grief. As investigators began piecing together the scale of the crimes, Canada was forced to confront the horrifying truth. One of the most prolific serial killers in its history had operated in plain sight for years. His victims had been women who were already marginalized, and their disappearance had gone unnoticed until it was far too late. By the time of his arrest, Robert Pickton was no longer just the strange farmer from Port Coquitlam. He was the embodiment of a systemic failure, a predator who exploited both human vulnerability and societal indifference. His crimes would lead to one of the largest investigations in Canadian history and a trial that would dominate headlines worldwide. By the late 1990s, whispers about Robert Pickton's farm had been circulating for years. Women were vanishing from Vancouver's downtown, Eastside, at an alarming rate, and families of the missing continued pressing police for answers. Though law enforcement initially dismissed many of the disappearances, the sheer number eventually became impossible to ignore. Still, it would take years before investigators connected the trail of missing women to the quiet, awkward pig farmer living on the outskirts of Port Coquitlam. The breakthrough came in 2002, but it was not the result of a sudden discovery of his crimes. Instead, police executed a search warrant on the Pickton farm for illegal firearms. During the raid, what they found was far beyond their expectations. While searching the cluttered property, officers stumbled upon items linked to missing women. Personal belongings that should not have been there. This discovery quickly transformed the case from a routine firearms search into a potential homicide investigation. The farm was immediately sealed off, and what followed became one of the largest crime scene investigations in Canadian history. Dozens of forensic experts were called in, working tirelessly to comb through every inch of the property. The task was overwhelming. The farm was filthy, sprawling, and filled with decades of accumulated junk, machinery, and animal waste. Yet beneath the chaos, horrifying evidence emerged. Investigators recovered women's clothing, identification cards, jewelry, and DNA samples that matched the missing women. Even more disturbing were the human remains that surfaced, fragments of bone, teeth, and tissue scattered across the property. Because Pickton had used farm equipment and pigs to dispose of bodies, the remains were incomplete and often damaged beyond recognition. The gruesome task of sifting through tons of soil and pig waste became a painstaking effort to bring closure to the families of the missing. As the evidence mounted, police realized they had uncovered a crime spree of staggering proportions. Robert Pickton was charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder, eventually facing 26 charges connected to women from Vancouver's downtown Eastside. But investigators suspected the true number of victims was even higher. Pickton himself would later boast of killing 49 women, claiming he had almost reached 50 before stopping. The trial of Robert Pickton became one of the most high-profile cases in Canadian history, beginning in 2006. It drew massive media attention, with journalists from across the globe reporting on the proceedings. Families of the victims filled the courtroom, desperate for justice, while the public followed every detail of the trial with shock and horror. Prosecutors presented a chilling case. They laid out how Pickton lured vulnerable women to his farm, often with offers of drugs, money, or shelter. Once there, he trapped them, murdered them, and disposed of their remains in ways that made recovery almost impossible. The evidence included DNA traces, forensic analysis, and witness testimony that painted a horrifying picture of the farm of death. One of the most disturbing revelations came from an undercover officer who was placed in Pickton's jail cell after his arrest. Believing he was speaking privately, Pickton bragged to the officer about his crimes. He claimed he was caught because of being sloppy and admitted to killing 49 women, laughing that he had planned to make it an even 50. This confession, captured on tape, became a key piece of evidence in showing not only his guilt, but also his utter lack of remorse. Despite the mountain of evidence, the trial was complicated. The defense argued that the remains and items found on the farm did not conclusively prove Pickton had committed the murders himself. They suggested that others might have been involved, or that the evidence was circumstantial. Nevertheless, the overwhelming forensic findings and Pickton's own words left little doubt in the minds of jurors. In 2007, after a lengthy trial, Robert Pickton was convicted on 6 counts of second-degree murder. Though he had faced 26 charges, the jury found him guilty of 6, and the Crown chose not to proceed with the remaining charges, believing the outcome would not change his sentence. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the maximum punishment available under Canadian law at the time. For many families of the victims, the verdict was bittersweet. While Pickton would never be free again, the limited number of convictions felt like an incomplete form of justice. Many relatives were frustrated that not all charges were pursued, leaving unanswered questions about the true number of women he had killed. The gruesome methods of body disposal also meant that, for some families, there would never be remains to bury, denying them closure. The trial also placed a harsh spotlight on law enforcement and government institutions. Families and advocates criticized the police for failing to act sooner, pointing out that reports of missing women had been ignored for years. A public inquiry was later launched, examining how systemic biases and indifference toward marginalized women had allowed Pickton to continue killing for so long. The inquiry concluded that discrimination against women in Vancouver's downtown Eastside played a significant role in the failure to stop him earlier. The case became a national scandal, raising uncomfortable questions about how society views and protects its most vulnerable citizens. Had the victims been from wealthier or more privileged backgrounds, many argued, the disappearances would have been investigated with far more urgency. Instead, women who struggled with poverty, addiction, or sex work were neglected until it was too late. Forensic work on the Pickton farm continued for years, costing millions of dollars and involving hundreds of specialists. The property was eventually bulldozed, but the memories of what happened there continue to haunt Canadians. The Pickton case remains the largest serial killer investigation in Canadian history, and one of the most disturbing reminders of how evil can hide in plain sight. Robert Pickton's arrest and conviction brought an end to his reign of terror, but the scars left behind run deep. Families of the victims continue to mourn, while the public struggles to comprehend how such horrific crimes could have gone undetected for so long. The trial did more than convict a killer. It exposed flaws in the justice system, challenged societal prejudices, and left behind lessons that Canadians are still grappling with today. When the gavel fell in 2007 and Robert William Pickton was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years, Canada breathed a collective sigh of relief. The man who had preyed on society's most vulnerable women, the so-called pig farmer killer, would never walk free again. But his incarceration did not erase the horrors of his crimes, nor did it bring full closure to the families who had lost loved ones. Instead, Pickton's imprisonment opened a new chapter in the national reckoning over what had happened, why it had been allowed to happen, and how Canada would remember one of its most prolific serial killers. Pickton was sent to a maximum security prison in British Columbia. There, he lived out his days in isolation, far removed from the farm where his atrocities had taken place. Described by prison officials as a quiet and unremarkable inmate, he rarely spoke and kept mostly to himself. He did not cause trouble behind bars, nor did he express remorse. To the public, this silence was infuriating. Many wanted answers, confessions, or even acknowledgement of the lives he had taken. Instead, Pickton remained withdrawn, the same socially awkward figure he had been in the outside world. Inmates, however, were well aware of who he was. His notoriety made him a target. Other prisoners despised him, not only for his crimes, but also for the cold, almost smug way he had once described them. Stories circulated of Pickton being threatened or harassed by fellow inmates. He was kept under close supervision, not for his own safety alone, but also to prevent him from becoming a symbol or trophy for others who might want to harm him to gain notoriety themselves. Over the years, rumors emerged about Pickton's attempts to write down his story. In 2016, a self-published book titled Pickton, in his own words, surfaced, allegedly based on a manuscript smuggled out of prison. The book caused outrage. Families of the victims were appalled that he would attempt to profit from or sensationalize his crimes. The Canadian government quickly moved to ban the sale of the book, and public backlash ensured it disappeared from circulation. Still, the fact that he had attempted to tell his side of the story served as a reminder of his lack of remorse. For Pickton, there was no redemption, only the continuing shadow of his evil deeds. Outside prison walls, the aftermath of his crimes continued to reverberate across Canada. For the families of the missing women, the pain never ended. Some had received confirmation of their loved ones' deaths through DNA evidence, while others were left with uncertainty. Because of the way Pickton disposed of bodies, many families would never receive remains to bury. This absence of closure compounded their grief, leaving wounds that could never fully heal. Public outrage also turned toward the institutions that had failed these women. The 2012 Missing Women Commission of Inquiry concluded that systemic racism, sexism, and neglect by law enforcement had contributed to Pickton's ability to kill unchecked for years. Police were criticized for dismissing missing persons reports, stereotyping women from Vancouver's downtown Eastside, and failing to connect the dots sooner. The inquiry led to recommendations for reform, including better communication between police agencies, improved handling of missing persons cases, and greater respect for vulnerable communities. Despite these recommendations, many advocates felt the changes were not enough. The Pickton case became a symbol of Canada's broader struggles with how it treats marginalized populations, especially Indigenous women who were disproportionately represented among his victims. It highlighted a painful truth that society often devalues certain lives, making them easier targets for predators. Pickton exploited this neglect, but the institutions meant to protect people bore responsibility as well. The physical site of Pickton's crimes also left a lasting scar. The farm, once a bustling crime scene filled with forensic teams, was eventually demolished. Nothing remains of the pig farm today, yet the memory of what occurred there is inescapable. For many in Port Coquitlam, the land is tainted by its history, a reminder that unimaginable evil had been hiding in plain sight just beyond their backyards. Pickton's legacy is not one of mystery or fascination, as with some infamous criminals, but one of disgust and horror. Unlike serial killers who sought infamy or tried to craft elaborate personas, Pickton was a simple, awkward man who lived in filth and killed in the shadows. His notoriety does not come from charisma or complexity, but from the scale of his cruelty and the failures that allowed it to continue. He represents the banality of evil, how someone so unremarkable could inflict so much devastation. In Canada, his name remains synonymous with systemic failure. Whenever discussions arise about missing and murdered Indigenous women, about marginalized communities, or about the shortcomings of law enforcement, the Pickton case is invoked. It serves as a grim reminder of what happens when society turns its back on the vulnerable. As of today, Robert Pickton remains in prison, serving his life sentence. He will be eligible for parole in the coming years, though it is highly unlikely he will ever be released. The public outcry alone would make such a decision politically and socially impossible. He will likely die behind bars, a forgotten figure locked away from the world he once terrorized. Yet, while Pickton himself fades from view, the lessons of his crimes remain vital. His story is not just about a killer, but about the women he targeted. Women who deserved better from their families, their communities, and their country. Their lives, though cut short, continue to fuel advocacy, awareness, and reform. They are the true legacy of this case. In the end, Robert Pickton's life serves as a cautionary tale on multiple levels. It shows how trauma, neglect, and isolation can breed darkness in an individual. It reveals how predators thrive when society ignores its most vulnerable. And it reminds us that justice, while necessary, can never fully heal the wounds left behind. Robert Pickton will forever be remembered as the pig farmer killer, a man whose crimes shocked a nation and forced Canada to confront uncomfortable truths. His story is not one of redemption or intrigue, but of horror, failure, and the long shadow of grief. The farm is gone, the man is locked away, but the memories of the victims remain, demanding that their lives not be forgotten.